Good evening, everyone. I don't see the numbers carrying on growing, so I will begin. Welcome to tonight's Hustings event. My name's Alan Crosby, and I'm the EIS president. Tonight, I am your Stephen Jardine, your Kirsty Wark, Fiona Bruce. For those older among you, David Dimbleby, even Robin Day, all thrown into one. The only difference is that I cannot pretend to be impartial. I'm the EIS president, and I stand by this document here, which is not showing up properly, our EIS manifesto. So I will be impartial when it comes to the party politics, but the policies, no, we stand by that manifesto, and I know all the candidates will have read that. The other thing that we in the EIS are not impartial about is this, that we take pride in teaching. Together with all my EIS colleagues, we stand in solidarity, support and love for every single one of our LGBTQ+ siblings. And we'll gather in our thousands on Saturday in Edinburgh at the Pride Day March and Rally. And I hope to see many of you who are watching this at that event. Tonight, colleagues, we're going to welcome several politicians. This kind of Hustings event is very important for our democracy. And we're very grateful to the panel for coming along today. Now, as you know, we, the EIS, we campaign on a range of issues that affect Scottish education. And all of the questions tonight that will be put to our political panel have come directly from the membership. And we'll be feeding in your comments on social media to the panel as the event goes on. So please do share your views on tonight's event using the hashtag EIS Hustings 2024. I myself won't be looking at the chat, but we do have people in the background doing that and passing me anything important that they feel I should be aware of. As tonight's chair, I'll be bringing in our panel members in turn to answer your questions. And I'd like to begin now by inviting each of our representatives to make a 3-minute opening statement. I'll introduce all the panel first, and then I'll explain the order. So please welcome Willie Rennie of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, Jenny Gilruth of the Scottish National Party, Liam Kerr, the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party, Pam Duncan-Glancy, Scottish Labour Party, and Nick Quayle of the Scottish Green Party. We will start in that order. So I would now like to invite Willie Rennie to make his opening 3-minute remarks.
Thanks very much, Alan, and thanks for putting this together. I think it's a great opportunity to discuss education. Even though this is devolved, I think it's very important that we debate something that's on the minds of young people, but also teachers and parents as well as employers. I think education is a big opportunity to lift people up in their life, people from disadvantaged backgrounds. It's a great leveller. And that's why when I gave up being leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, I asked to be the education spokesperson, because I think it's one of the most important portfolios that there is in the Scottish Parliament, and I'm sure my colleagues feel exactly the same. I think there's a number of challenges. I've not seen education facing the challenges that it does right now. The pandemic has obviously made matters much more challenging, but some of the issues were bubbling away before that. So first of all, the issue of contracts, short-term contracts, but also shortage of contracts altogether, particularly for primary school. And then the shortage of some specialists in terms of the STEM subjects in secondary school. So we need to try and get a grips of the workforce management. We are continuing to aim to recruit 3,500 extra teachers, according to the government, but we're nowhere near that, and that's leading to a surplus of teachers who are not finding positions of employment. So we need to get to grips with the workforce management and the number that we're training. In terms of the classroom, behaviour, absence and additional support needs are 3 challenges that have come and are interlinked in many ways. And we need to look to the new plan that's coming out from the government to try and get to grips with all those 3 issues. And I think there's a rebalance and empowerment of teachers to make sure they have all the necessary tools within the class to be able to cope with these circumstances, including additional resources with pupil support assistants, and other specialist backup support as well is required. Colleges. Colleges, I've never seen them so depressed. Whereas they give a great opportunity to lift people up from disadvantaged backgrounds, they have been underfunded now for 10, 12 years following the regionalisation programme. And that needs to change as well. And it's a particular important priority for me that we get a sector that doesn't have a particularly big voice in the public to give them inequality. And then the final aspect in the classroom is around about, in terms of school education, is reform programme. And I'm disappointed we seem to have lost pace with that, and that the new national bodies that we were aiming to reform seem to not be reformed in the way we'd like. I want to see assessment, exams, and SNSAs resolved as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Willie. Jenny Gilruth, would you like to make your statement?
Good evening. Thank you to Alan for the opportunity to join you all this evening. I'm very grateful to my former trade union, the EIS, for organising tonight's hustings. And of course, as Willie's alluded to, because while education is of course devolved, decisions that are taken at Westminster undoubtedly have an impact in our schools. And that's really in terms of the funding that we have available. And let's be honest, 14 years of Westminster austerity has had an impact. The SNP within that context has done all that we can to protect Scotland's budget. We've made decisions to raise revenue from the people who can afford it, folk like me. But that's why we've been able to invest, of course, additional amounts in education, record levels this year alone. But look, I'll be totally upfront. I wish we were in a position where I could invest even more, because that is what is needed for Scotland's children and for those that we entrust to deliver their education. That's why in this election, the SNP is demanding an end to austerity and for a change of approach from Labour and the Tories and their united commitment to more cuts. Of course, the other major impact Westminster decisions have in our classrooms is in terms of the scourge of child poverty. And having taught hungry children in a previous life, I know from direct experience how poverty interacts with attainment and outcomes. That's why the SNP has invested in the most generous provision of free school meals in the UK. It's why we're investing over £1 billion in the Scottish Attainment Challenge over the course of this Parliament. That's protected funding, which is making a real difference in our schools. And it's also why we're going into this campaign demanding an end to policies like the two-child cap, which of course would lift 300,000 children out of poverty across the UK. So as we approach the end of the busy summer term, I want to place on the record my thanks to Scotland's teachers who go above and beyond every day to support our young people. And whilst I look forward to the hustings this evening, I think it's also important to remember there is so much to be positive about in Scotland's education system. We have the gap between the richest and the poorest in literacy at a record low in our primary schools. In last year's exam results, we had the highest ever number of passes at National 5 level since that qualification was introduced. And when young people leave school, they benefit from free university tuition rather than paying fees of over £9,000 a year in Tory-run England or Labour-run Wales. Since the SNP abolished tuition fees, the number of Scottish students going to university has grown by 31%. We've got record numbers of students from our poorest communities attending university, and student debt levels in Scotland are almost 3 times lower than they are in England. I'm very proud of the SNP's record on education, but I don't shy away from the need to drive further improvements through our ambitious programme on education reform. Our teachers have to be at the heart of that process, because there is absolutely nothing more important in providing our children with a quality education than good classroom teaching. You make all the difference, and I very much look forward to this evening's hustings, and I thank the EIS again for organising this tonight.
Thank you very much, Jim. I'd like Liam Kerr to give your statement, Liam.
Yeah, thank you, Alan, and good evening, everyone. So I am delighted to be here. I'm delighted that the EIS has organised this, because it seems to me that there's a real risk in a general election that where we've got a fully devolved matter like education, that there's a risk that it could fall off the agenda. And I'm really pleased that the EIS are making sure that this remains firmly on the agenda, and particularly that after 17 years of the SNP in charge of our education system in Scotland, that they're not allowed to simply, as I'm afraid Ms. Gilruth just heard, blame everything on governments elsewhere. And it seems to me that education is key here, and the key issue in the general election that will impact on Scotland is Labour's proposal to levy VAT on the independent sector. Now, regardless of one's view on independent schools, my view is certainly that that will have very serious negative consequences, not only for the independent sector, but also for the state sector and for those of you who work in it. And I think that's a very key consideration. But in terms of the devolved issues, I really commend the EIS for ensuring that the MSPs are here. And I also commend the manifesto, the Stand Up for Quality Education campaign, because there are, as Willie Rennie said, significant issues in the system. And I think that there's a real concern that the government is not dealing with it. Willie Rennie raised the reform agenda, which we're still waiting on. And there are ample examples of this, of things just not being dealt with, promises from the last manifesto not being delivered. And above all, and I'll talk about this no doubt later, silo thinking, where the education system, the government seems to think of in isolation rather than looking at the macro picture across society. Much of this mirrors our New Deal for Teachers, which we published last year. Much of the Stand Up for Quality Education, I'm pleased to say, mirrors our New Deal for Teachers. And in terms of things like further education, it mirrors our Grasping the Thistle economic paper that we published last year, but no doubt we'll talk about that later. I think it is a significant agenda tonight because there are many challenges. I agree with Jenny Goruth. There's a lot to celebrate. There is no doubt, there is no one that will disagree that our teachers, our staff are working extraordinarily hard to deliver the best education they can. But they're doing that in a context of violence, of job insecurity, as you heard earlier. How we respond, how the government responds, the Scottish Government responds to the increase in ASN needs. And of course, Jenny Goruth talked there about the attainment gap, which has gone up. So I'm very pleased to be doing it. There is money there, which we'll interrogate later. It's about the choices the government makes. Thank you very much.
Would you like to make your comments? Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that, Alan.
It's Pam Duncan-Glancy is next.
Thank you. Sorry, forgive me, Alan. I didn't catch it either, and I wasn't sure if it was on my end or not. First of all, thank you so much for hosting tonight and for having us here. I'm really proud to be here. And I'd like to also, as others have done, thank you for all you're doing in education in Scotland, because I know how hard it is just now. And I know that because I'm out speaking with you on a regular basis to hear what it's like on the front line, delivering education for our young people across Scotland. And there's no doubt that our education system is lucky to have such committed professionals delivering and working tirelessly for children and young people in the face of what I consider to be gross under-resourcing and not enough support from your government. And you're all working more than ever before and beyond capacity. I and my party believe and have done for years that we must support you to ensure that all children and young people in Scotland receive a quality education. And I don't think there's anyone on the panel who would disagree with that either. But that system needs to be resourced, supported, and at a level that realises that. I don't believe it currently is. And we will, of course, come on to talk about some of the ways that we might help find the funding for that. As teachers and educators, you're being expected to do far more work with far less time, money and support from the government. And I regret that we're now seeing the consequences of that, some of which we've touched on this evening. So we know that there are more teachers leaving the profession early, that probation teachers are in precarious work, that burnouts are its highest in years, that workload is soaring, that teacher mental health is suffering, that non-contact time is too high and class sizes are too big. We know that colleges are absolutely on the brink, that courses are being cut and staff are being forced to strike for years and years on end just for a fair deal. And we know that the Trade Union Education Centre in the city of Glasgow College, in my own region of Glasgow, is in a perilous state because it's one of the areas that looks to be cut, which of course we know is not just an attack on education, but it's an attack on the trade union movement. The Tory government's decisions, there's no doubt about it, have ruined our economy, put up our bills, reduced the money we have for public services like education. But the SNP's incompetence and inability to plan has also seen them raid budgets like PEF in year, pit educator against educator by raiding college budgets for teacher deals. And none of that is an acceptable way to run it. We believe that that's a failure of both governments to deliver economic growth and has left public services in crisis. But this is not as good as it gets. I firmly believe that Scotland's best days lie ahead of us, that we can change our country, and that this election is an opportunity to do that. And with our first 6 steps, we think we can restore hope and rebuild our country again. We'll deliver economic growth to put money in pockets and in our public services. We'll cut NHS waiting times with funding for over 160,000 additional appointments every year, paid by cracking down on tax avoidance and non-dom loopholes. We'll set up Great British Energy, a publicly owned clean power company, bringing down bills and bringing jobs to Scotland, and we'll make work pay with our new deal for working people. We'll create jobs for young people and give 40,000 of them a pay rise, because we'll remove the rules that mean that they get less on the minimum wage than others. So those are just some of the things we'll do at the general election. And I know that tonight we'll talk more about what we'll do.
Pam, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we have to ask you to pause there. You're over your 3 minutes. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Finally, I'd like to ask Nick Quayle, Scottish Greens. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, Nick, over to you.
Okay. Again, everyone else, thank you for inviting me this evening. I should just say this is my first ever Hustings event, so it's great to be here as a current member of the EIS and a representative of the Scottish Green Party. And thanks to everyone who's joined us online, particularly if you've just finished a hard day of teaching. That is true dedication to come online and do a bit of politics in the evening. My name is Nick Quayle. I'm the Scottish Green candidate for Glasgow West. I'm recently retired after some 30 years in teaching, with the last 7 as a secondary head teacher. And I also served for many years as an EIS learning rep. So I can truly say, colleagues, this election is crucial. We are facing a climate emergency that is not a distant threat, but a pressing reality impacting us all, especially the children we teach. Earlier this month, the UN Secretary General warned that the battle to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees will be won or lost in the 2020s. This means that the next government here in the UK has a pivotal role to play. The Scottish Green Party is the only party that's serious about tackling the climate catastrophe, investing in renewable energy and promoting sustainable public transport. Our Green New Deal investment programme proposes to increase annual public investment by around 28 billion, or 1% of GDP. The Scottish Greens, like the EIS, believe in fighting for equality, social justice and the climate education. We prioritise the well-being of our pupils, people and planet over individual profit, protecting the future of the children that we are all committed to. And it's for that reason that we would introduce a wealth tax on the top 1% of households, over 70 billion in public service, including education. So vote like our future depends on it. Vote for the Scottish Greens.
Thank you very much, all of you, for laying out your stalls there and setting the context. For those at home, we're now going to move into our questions. Now, our questions are set as themes, and some of them are very long because they kind of have several questions within them. Others are short, but they've all come from you, our members. All panelists got sight of these a little earlier, so they've had a little bit of time to think about them and get prepared for them. Here is our first theme. Colleges play a crucial role in lifting people out of poverty. They provide opportunities for adult returners to retrain or pick up on their learning journey. They provide young people with pathways into work and higher education. To the panel, do you see the main role of FE to support learners or local employers? Will your party seek to increase or decrease the capacity of the FE sector? The EIS FILA has had to enter into industrial dispute in 9 years out of the past 10, just for a below inflation cost of living pay rise. What would you suggest is done to improve this situation? Should FE staff be protected from compulsory redundancies as other public sector staff are? The order will now change, and we're first going to Liam Kerr, please.
Right, thank you for that. Okay, I'll try and deal with all of those questions in turn. So the role of further education. Certainly I and my party, and I suspect all the panel, see just how important further education is. I think it's about supporting all people. I think it's a critical part of the future economy, but it's a critical part of equipping, I was going to say young people, but it's not. It's all learners. I mean, I am an adult learner in college, and it's about providing the skills for the future, both in their own right for the individual, but also, of course, for the future economy. And that's something that our Grasping the Thistle that I mentioned earlier, our economy paper, picks up. It talks about the parity of esteem, which again goes back to the reform agenda, which seems to have been delayed. It's about building strong partnerships between the FE sector and the employer, and it's about recognizing the lifelong learning that I alluded to. Should we increase capacity? Yes, of course. I think Pam Duncan-Glancy made a really important point earlier on. The slashing of funding that our further education, that our brilliant colleges have seen over a very long time is absolutely disgraceful. And I cannot understand, again, to go back to my silo thinking that I mentioned earlier, I cannot understand how any sensible government looking holistically at what we need as a country, what we need to equip in our country, and how we provide education as an end in itself, can justify the cuts that they've made. So certainly I am not in favour of that. I'm very much in favour of increasing capacity and support to our further education sector. On the industrial dispute point, I think there's been talk about an independent chair to mediate, but I think the key point here is if the government is going to make these public bodies, I'll finish on this point then. If the government is going to make these public bodies, then surely it has a duty to get involved. It cannot sit this one out if it is going to take control of the colleges and then say, when it gets difficult, listen, we're not going to be part of this. I think that's an abdication of responsibility, and I'd like to see that change.
Thank you very much. I should have made clear to all the panelists, we're going to try and give 3 minutes for each question for each of you to try to keep to time and get through everything. Thank you. We'll go to Nick next.
I have to say that there's a lot to unpack here, but I'll try and do my best. First of all, I believe, and certainly the Green Party, that industrial relations and the further education sector are clearly broken, and it needs a reset. The Scottish Greens have guaranteed trade union representation in all college boards in Scotland, and I think that would go a long way to alleviating some of the problems, the years and years of dispute that we seem to be constantly embroiled in further education. But all this is meaningless if management continue to ignore processes and disrespect the right to take action. That's why the Green Party would remove the anti-trade union laws that the Tory party has brought in. And that's why it's a bit rich when I hear Liam talking about his plans for further education, when one of the causes of that has been the Tory anti-trade union laws. If further education lecturers had the same were involved board in a partnership, I think we'd have the same problem. The other thing I'd like to also point to is the increased marketisation of higher education. This continual drive to constantly make as much money as possible. Again, it's one of the things I think we've taken a wrong turning with further education and higher education in particular as well. We have to have an education system that is there to serve our society, whatever generates the most income. Pam referred to the trade unions, and there's a great example of how something that doesn't generate money, but something personally I think is very beneficial to society, should be protected. Because it's not because the college management,
1 minute,
then they then decide to get rid of it. And this is something, again, we see time and time again, particularly in further education. If an area doesn't make money, additional support needs sector, learning support, then the money isn't there. The money goes into the areas that they have to justify making a profit. That marketisation, I think, has been an increasing problem. Can I just say that Ross Greer, last year secured a parliamentary inquiry into the funding of college sectors and has brought much needed political scrutiny to the issue. And it's only by this re-examination of how we're operating, particularly how we're operating around our pay and bargaining sector, that we're going to actually reach a resolution. So yeah, I will stop there since I've got the countdown.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Nick. Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you very much. It breaks my heart actually to see what's happening in further education across Scotland just now. I've been on the picket line with staff in colleges since before I got elected, because I fundamentally believe in the role of colleges. I went to college, I understand the importance of college, not just for building the skills of the future that Scotland needs, which is a key role that colleges have, and our focus would be to restore the potential in colleges to do that, but also to deliver for their communities, so that young people, particularly people from disadvantaged backgrounds, have an opportunity to get and to progress. Education for education's sake, but also education to give them security, a job, a career, something that they're passionate about. And colleges are historically excellent at that. And it really has been heartbreaking to see the under-resourcing and disrespect, to be quite honest, that they've experienced over recent years. I think it's unacceptable that the Minister has not intervened in any of the disputes and has left a situation where staff are having their wages deemed, docked, however you want to describe it, but taken off them, which I believe to be anti-trade union, which is why, incidentally, it's important for me to say that we would repeal anti-trade union legislation, including the Strikes Act. And it's something that I think this Minister really, really should get a grip with. His claims to date so far, particularly after the lessons learned report, have been that it would not be helpful for ministerial intervention. I don't agree with that. I don't believe it would undermine resolution. I think it would support resolution to have that leadership. And on leadership, I think the government have been entirely failed in their leadership for colleges, in not giving them the direction that they need, not helping them understand what it is they want for them, and leaving them squeezed in between school and university. On some of the specifics about what would I do about that, and what do we need to do to reset industrial relations, I believe that the absence of facility time for trade union reps on boards is a problem that needs to be rectified. It also is a problem in the national machinery that needs to be rectified. I think action points need to be getting followed up, because I know that too often when the national machinery come together, action points don't get followed up. Information sharing needs to improve greatly. I agree, as I said earlier, that ministerial intervention could help with this, and I'm really disappointed that we've not seen that so far. I think one of the things that he could be doing is to encourage even the pooling of knowledge between the employers and the trade unions and people on the front line to go together to talk about what they need and what support they want in a budget. And I think there should be a stronger role for the Scottish Funding Council in terms of the governance of these colleges, so that they can act in the interest of learners and staff. Thank you.
Thank you. Jenny Goulding, just before I bring you in, I'd just like to read you a line from the SNP manifesto, page 23. Under Standing Up for Workers. The UK government should learn from the recent success of the Scottish government and resolve industrial disputes through constructive negotiations. I think lecturers and teachers across Scotland might be forgiven that that line was written by Armando Iannucci. Is that what happened?
Sorry, is that an additional question, Alan? Or
it's just an introduction to that question for you.
Right, okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I think it's really worthwhile pointing out the strength of Scotland's colleges sector. I've heard reference to my minister in that respect, and I might come back to talk to some of that. But as Cabinet Secretary, I see really fantastic work with our schools, with employers on a almost monthly basis. Mr. Day's out there, of course, engaging with colleges every single week. But in Scotland, we have higher tertiary education levels amongst adults than in most OECD countries. And I think it's hugely important that we enhance the role of the FE sector. I think that was the original question. It plays such a pivotal role in supporting our curriculum in schools, but also that breadth of offer that other parts of our education system just can't reach. So I think it's hugely important we celebrate the strength of Scotland's colleges, but I am live to the challenge here. So a number of the questions, I think Alan alluded to funding, and I do want to touch on funding where some of the challenge rests at the current time. I think it's worthwhile pointing out that we have protected funding for colleges in the most recent budget settlement. So we have maintained funding this year at the same levels as last year. And that is despite a brutal cut to our overall budget from the Conservatives. So the 24-25 budget allocates nearly £2 billion to colleges and universities. But we cannot view funding to colleges or to any other part of our education system as being siloed from decisions taken elsewhere. And both Labour and the Conservatives are complicit in their silence on the £18 billion of cuts that the IFS, the independent IFS, predicts is going to come as a result of spending decisions taken by the Conservatives and that Labour will not walk away from. That is going to harm our colleges sector. So we have to be cognizant about these decisions impacting on the ability of governments in Scotland, irrespective of political party, to put in additional investment. So within the current confines of our funding, we've been able to protect funding to colleges. However, I very much recognise the ongoing challenge here. It's not going to get any better if we continue with an austerity agenda, be it under a Labour government or a Tory one. In terms of industrial action, I think we've had a number of years of industrial action in the colleges sector. This obviously hasn't grown up in the past year alone, but I know it's not where our lecturers want to be. And I would agree with Nick on the need for a reset in relation to negotiations. We've heard some commentary from others in relation to the role of SNP ministers. So I just want to put on record that the SNP very much expects employers and trade unions to work together to reach settlements that are both fair and affordable without the need for further industrial action. We want strong partnerships and we want fair work principles. And the Minister for Higher Education has met regularly with trade unions and employers, urging both sides to continue to negotiate a mutual settlement. I spoke to him only today about this matter, and I see my time is up, but we are working really hard in government to help bring about a resolution, recognising that this dispute has been ongoing for a number of years now, and it's really important we provide that support because we want a strengthened colleges sector, to the original question.
Thank you, Jenny. Willie Rennie, finally. You're on mute, Willie.
Yeah, sorry. I'm going to start off with something controversial, I think, for this audience. I actually think Graham Day is a decent minister. I think he's interested in it. I think, unlike some of his predecessors, he is engaged and he's trying to find solutions. Now, that's separate from the policy where I would have a disagreement with the government and with Graham Day. Jenny was right to say that there is some excellent work going on in the colleges. I've been around many of them and I've seen that excellent work. But that doesn't really tie up with the £26 million cut that was made in year. And this is where the insult was to the injury, because they took the money from colleges to pay for the deal for teachers that ministers intervened to resolve, that they now refuse to intervene to resolve within the college sector. So it's the double standards, it's the different treatment that I find particularly insulting. And that's on top of the previous year's cuts and years on years cut. And I know Jenny will point to some years when it's gone up marginally, but over the period of 10 to 12 years, it's down quite significantly. And we see that within our colleges, they're much smaller footprint. I think colleges have got a unique role. They do a number of different things, which they don't do in other parts of the United Kingdom. They are a route to higher education that in other parts isn't provided. And that's something that we should protect very, very closely, because young people from disadvantaged backgrounds might not want to take the big step of going right to university as the first stab. So we need to make sure that that route is preserved. The skills that they provide, particularly for the renewables sector, but also other sectors that are going through a transition, are really important as well. And they bring up those disadvantaged young people as well. And also mature learners that in some years have been ignored. I think the fundamental problem is that the sector isn't valued as a whole. And it's not valued because it doesn't have a bigger voice as other sectors have got. And that needs to change. I'm a sucker for an underdog, and that's why I feel really quite strongly about the college sector, that it does need extra support for all the reasons that I've just pointed out. We need to give it the opportunity to transform our economy. And I do think they do that in partnership with employers. I don't think it's a separate thing. Employers have got an important role to play, and therefore we should be working in partnership. It's not an either or, but colleges have been undervalued, and that needs to change.
Thank you very much, Willie. And of course, just to round off that theme, the FE sector is already within the public sector. Our second theme is a very short question, and we will change the order again. The question is, will you end austerity, increase or introduce taxes on wealth, and invest in education, health, and democratic well-being? Pam, I'm going to come to you first, but let me just say a couple of things. I had a wee dig at SNP, let me have a wee dig at you. Labour surely have bottled it on wealth taxes. They're not nearly ambitious enough on redistribution, and you're just austerity 2.0, are you not?
Thank you very much for that, Alan, and I appreciate it. And it won't surprise you to hear that no, I don't agree with that. And I'll tell you why. So we've been really clear that a vote for the Labour Party and a Labour government will not mean continued austerity. Quite the opposite. And both Anas Sarwar and indeed Keir Starmer in the UK Labour Party have said exactly that. But to help understand how we can say that and how we can get away with saying that, and how you can hopefully believe us, first of all, we will introduce a proper windfall tax on the oil and gas giants who are making over £60 billion in profits, £60 million a day in profits. So we'll tax that. We will set up a COVID corruption commissioner to make sure that we can get back the money that was stolen from us during the COVID pandemic. We will close loopholes in the non-dom tax status to give us money to invest in our public services like the NHS. We will tackle tax avoidance to make sure that those who should be paying tax here do pay tax here. And I know that my committee colleague, Liam Kerr, mentioned this earlier on about the VAT on private schools. Private schools are a business, and we will end the tax break for VAT that they enjoy. That will give us approximately 100 to 120 million pounds to spend additionally in Scotland, just as a result of that one single move alone. And what will that do in education? Well, we set out some of what our vision for the 26 approach could be, so that this is obviously about a general election and you get a flavour of what we'll do in terms of what I've just said to raise taxes. But what will that mean? Well, what it will mean for us in Scotland is that we can have more support to help young people in schools, more staff to support our young people in schools. It will mean greater choice and equality in the curriculum so that it delivers for what we need it to, with a focus on skills in literacy, numeracy, STEM, digital and culture, and more opportunities to see a broadening in the curriculum, not a narrowing. We'll have robust data collection so that we can respond to need, and particularly for pupils with additional support needs. I think it'll be a really helpful way to understand what they need, so that if they move schools or even when they move classes, the information that we have about them is really key. We will replace the SQA and Education Scotland. We'll have an independent inspectorate. Pupils in Scotland, we've said we want them to be the most digitally literate within a decade, because we understand the importance of the digital economy and of digital literacy. We'll support teachers with sufficient non-contact time and resources, a workforce plan to ensure that staff teams are there to provide all the support that we need. So we've heard about some of the gaps in the workforce, both in terms of geographical, but also in terms of subject areas. We'll address that with a proper workforce plan that looks forward to the future and protects our staff in the present. Thank you.
Very much, Pam. Jenny Gilruth, please.
Thank you, Alan. So as your members might be aware, the SNP launched our manifesto yesterday, and at the core of our manifesto is really an offer to the people of Scotland, moderate left of centre policies to make their lives better. We know that the Westminster system is broken, and for far too many people, the UK economy has failed. We've had 14 years of Tory austerity, Brexit and the cost of living crisis, and complicity from Labour and the Conservatives in relation to the cuts that we know are coming. Labour and the Tories are now pretty much indistinguishable on austerity. We've got Labour signed up to those same fiscal rules, which effectively bind them to Tory spending plans. They're going to keep Tory tax cuts to help the rich while being committed to Tory spending plans that will see those £18 billion of cuts. And we've even had the Shadow Chancellor and other Labour frontbenchers lining up to praise Margaret Thatcher in recent months. That is indicative of how they intend to govern. It's going to have a major impact on public services like the NHS and, yes, our schools and education more broadly. In the last year alone, we faced a huge cut to our capital budget, which, if we reverse, would allow us to take action like building more schools. But Labour is intending to carry on with the same austerity agenda that's failing our economy, damaging public services and pushing more of our children into poverty. Scotland needs an alternative to austerity, not more of the same with Labour, and the SNP are the only party offering that real change by taking decisions in Scotland for Scotland with independence.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, you've got about a minute and a half.
Okay, I'll keep going then. On child poverty, we know too that Labour under Keir Starmer have embraced the worst aspects of Conservative welfare policies. They're more interested in that race to the right with the Tories than tackling child poverty. And with the limited powers we already have in Scotland, we are taking direct action. So we're lifting approximately 100,000 children out of poverty this year alone through our game-changing Scottish Child Payment. But in contrast, we have Labour simply mirroring the worst extremes of Tory policy, including the two-child limit and the rape clause. We now have a Labour leader who wants to cap child benefits but not bankers' bonuses. So I think we have a failing Westminster consensus on these issues, which is failing people in Scotland. That is why we need to take all of these decisions in Scotland for the people of Scotland. And finally, Alan, we haven't really touched this evening on Brexit and the impact that's had on Scotland's budget. And it, of course, is supported by Labour and the Tories and has hit our economy really hard, cutting the money that would otherwise have flowed to Scotland in relation to public services. So we know that Brexit has cost the UK economy nearly £70 billion in lost output. That's a loss of £2.3 billion in lost public revenue for Scotland. So that's almost half the entire Scottish education budget, i.e. all the spending on childcare, schools, colleges and universities. Almost all Scottish spending on colleges, universities and apprenticeships is just over £2 billion. So that is significantly impacting on the resource that we have at our disposal in Scotland at the current time. Austerity, Brexit, the cost of living crisis are Westminster-made problems. They are supported by both the Labour and the Conservative Party, and it's only the SNP that will stand up for Scotland to make sure that Scotland's voice is heard.
Thank you, Jenny. Nick Quayle is next.
I'm tempted to quote Greta here and blah, blah, blah. It's the same old nonsense. We cannot fix the current austerity without raising taxes. Other parties are scared of actually grasping that nettle. Let me give you one fact. Since the Tories came to power, today the 5 richest families in the UK are wealthier than the bottom 20% of the population. 12.6 million. 5 families. That system is wrong. The Green Party are the only party that say we need to tax the wealthy. And when I say wealthy, we're talking about the top 1% of the households in the UK, those with 3.4 million or above. This would start marginally at 1% rising to 5%. That will raise £75 billion for our public services. So to go back and answer the question, or the questioner who said, will we end austerity? That actually is a realistic plan to do it by actually spending money on education, by taxing the wealthy. Anyone that's worked in teaching will tell you it has been cut throughout the Tory. All roads lead back to Westminster. The funding has not come through to Scotland. Scotland and MSPs and councillors have this crazy choice of whether they cut here or cut there. What we need is more money, and the way of getting more money, progressive taxation of wealthy. And other things that we can do as well, income tax more progressives, as we've done in Scotland, bring the into line, would raise an additional 11 billion. I mean, Pam mentioned earlier on about a windfall tax on the gas industry. Well, how about cutting subsidies start, which amounts to 18 billion right now? 18 billion, that's the same as the black hole that everyone's trying to cover up. That's right now what we are giving to oil and gas industry. How about removing that, Pam? How about taking the subsidies from oil and gas and taxing them for the damage they're doing to the environment and redistributing that wealth into education? In addition, the Green Party also want to cap the price of food essentials during peaks of inflation, as was done in France, not these crazy, wacky ideas. French did it in 2023. These measures can be targeted distribution retailers, abolish the standing charge for domestic electricity customers, and of course, what Labour is too frightened to drop the vase, too scared to scare the horses, bring an end to the benefit cap on 2 children. That is a nonsense. It's an abomination in a civilized society. Any teacher will tell you that poverty is one of the biggest drivers against educational attainment. Let's get real about this, folks. Let's start putting the money into education by taxing the wealthy and those who can afford it.
Much, Nick. I made a mistake. Willie Rennie should have been there, so apologies if it all gets a wee bit mixed up after that, but I will take Willie now. Willie.
Yeah, well, I take a different view from Nick. I am for increasing some taxes, but I'm not going to go wild like he's just suggested. I think we need to try and grow the economy.
It's not wild, Willie. It's 1% of the population. It's hardly wild. And you know as well as I do that over the last years, the tax rate on the rich is steady. Sorry.
Thank you, Nick. A wee bit of toing and froing. I think we can handle that, but maybe not over a minute or so. So, Willie, a wee extra 10 or 20 seconds for you.
Okay. So I'm not going to go wild. I think the list of taxes that Nick has listed would actually cause significant damage, and we've seen some of that with the green policies in government. So we need to have a measured approach. We need to grow the economy, but we need to try and raise the revenues. And I would suggest from the bankers' bonuses. And the second one would be the oil and gas excess profits. And the third would be the digital tax. We would double that. And that would give us some extra investment that we could use to try and invest in important areas. And I would argue around about mental health, social care in particular, alongside education would be the priorities. But we need to make sure that we're doing so in an orderly fashion. Because I want to make sure that we can have an economy that's thriving, that creates more jobs and opportunity for people, that allows companies to invest, to create the jobs that we're all desperate to be created. So I want to grow the economy. I don't want any more of the extremes that we've had in recent years. The Liz Truss budget, the Boris Johnson Brexit, even the independence agenda has taken us in chaotic fashion to a number of different extremes. And I want a bit of order back into government so we can try and help people who are on the breadline, who are struggling to pay their bills, who are struggling to get a house, who are struggling to get a decent education. And if we can do all those things, I think we'll serve people quite well. So I am against austerity. I want to bring that to an end. But I want to make sure that when we're doing so, that we grow the economy, create opportunities for people, and try and get a country that's in a much better order and is respected across the globe in a way that it used to be, in terms of growing the economy, but also in creating opportunities for people. That's me.
I can give you a bit longer, Willie, if you would like.
No, it's fine.
Fine, thank you so much. Now, Liam, just before I bring you in, we've struggled to find a Scottish Conservative manifesto, but beyond that, austerity, Brexit, Trussonomics, all of these have caused extensive damage that has been widely reported. One joint study between the University of Glasgow and the Glasgow Centre for Population Health found that people across the UK are dying younger as a result of austerity and all these policies, with people living in the poorest areas hardest hit. How can we trust Conservatives on anything related to the economy?
Because we have to remember, since we're here about the EIS and education, and I will come back to the choices that we make about how the economy goes, but education is a devolved matter. And when Nick says the funding is not all coming, well, we need to be clear. These are about Scottish Government choices. The Scottish Government is sitting on the largest cash terms block grant in devolution history, 43 or more than 43 billion. Adjusted for inflation, that's still 10% more than it was pre-COVID. The resource budget is up at record levels. Jenny Gilruth talked about the capital budget. The capital budget in that is about £6 billion. And yes, it is being cut. And that is not good. I'm not happy about that, but that's the choice that's made. It's about £200 million a year. £200 million is about what the Scottish Government is getting sued for by, I think, BIFA for their failure on DRS. It's about half, in fact, it's less than half of what they've spent on ferries that don't sail. It's less than half of what they're handing back, the 450 million that they're handing back to the EU. So there is money there. It's about how the Scottish Government, the SNP government, and remember, the Scottish Green Party, who were in government until a couple of months ago, choose to spend it. And just on this point about taxes, don't forget the Scottish Government does have power to increase taxes. And we know that because it has done so, with the result that if you earn more than about £28,000, you are paying more tax than you would be elsewhere in the UK. So this is about the choices that they make. And I agree with the question. We should be investing more in education, in health, in well-being. And that means delivering on manifesto promises. That means delivering on free breakfasts, on free lunches, in order that when children present at school, they are ready to learn. It means delivering on free laptops so that the children, regardless of their circumstances, can engage in a proper way. And it goes back to this silo thinking that I've mentioned a lot, which if we start thinking holistically, if the SNP government starts thinking holistically about the place of education and how it all interrelates, then we can start talking about outcomes. The SNP government should be saying, what is the society? How do we want this to look in 10, 15, 20 years? And rather than playing whack-a-mole with the issues as they come up in the health portfolio and the justice portfolio and the education portfolio, the Scottish Government needs to start properly funding, properly resourcing, properly respecting the education sector in Scotland, because that is where the outcomes for all those other portfolios will be delivered. And ultimately, by doing that, you generate the economy, you give people the skills, build the economy that Willie Rennie mentioned, and Scotland remains, but becomes an even better place to live, grow up and work.
Thank you all. Just before we move on to our third theme for this evening, I do want to say I'm all up for lively debate. And if people want to kind of chip in, I think that's fine. I will try and give people extra time if it happens, but let's keep it short and sharp, like a wee quick intervention. And I think things are cooking now. Things are going well, and it's really good to hear all of you getting into the issues. So thank you. Our third issue is a long one, and we've heard directly from a member. I'm going to read what they've said to us. I currently work in enhanced provision school. Half my class is violent, and after an incident this year, one child hit me so hard I was in A&E with a possible fractured collarbone and was in agony and on pain relief. My question is, will we employ more learning support assistants? We're being cut beyond belief, and we're losing 1 or 2 learning support assistants every year in our school, and the violence is increasing every day. I'm physically assaulted at least 2 or 3 times a month, and I'm verbally assaulted every day. How can we change this? I feel due to a lack of staff, resources and support, I am failing children and being hurt in the meantime. How will this be made better? In addition, in Glasgow, there has been an increase in incidents of violence and aggression. However, we're still losing up to 450 teachers over the next 3 years. What steps will each of the parties take to keep our teachers and young people safe, especially given the context of local authorities like Glasgow, who seem set on cutting teacher numbers? And I will start with Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Alan. So a really topical question this evening, and one which we spent a great deal of time in the chamber discussing over the course of the last year. And I think, first of all, worthwhile reflecting some of the shift we've seen here post-pandemic. Although I think there was challenge in the system prior to the pandemic, it's undoubtedly the case that lockdown for many of our young people has impacted on the way in which they engage with their teachers, in the way in which they engage with formal education, even in talking to my friends who are still teachers, and doing things like being asked to sit down and take off their jackets, simple instructions that you might issue as a classroom teacher now become a battle and often can lead to confrontation. So for many of our young people, there are challenges post-pandemic, but there are also poverty challenges. And we've talked today about austerity and policy decisions taken elsewhere. Poverty is impacting on our young people before they cross the school gates, and that is impacting too in our classrooms, and we need to be cognizant of that additionally. I first of all say to Scotland's teachers and to your members that no teacher should go to their place of work feeling like that. I'm very sorry to hear about the story we've heard today, but I have to say, as Education Secretary, I have members from your union, but others additionally, who often contact me to share some of their experiences. I think worthwhile looking at some of the action I can take as Education Secretary. So we've had a number of parliamentary events, we've had a number of behaviour summits. Those have been really important for people to feel it was a safe space to share their experiences. I have to be honest with you, Alan, many teachers often feel it's not a safe space to speak up, and I don't think that's good enough. So we need to create those environments for people to feel they're able to talk about what's happened, but also for local authorities to support their staff. So there's a role for me as Education Secretary here to strengthen some of the provision around about our expectations on behaviour in schools. That's why we'll be publishing very shortly a national action plan on behaviour. That's the action that I'm taking as Education Secretary at national level. But we also need our local authorities at local level to drive the behavioural change we need to support staff and to support our young people. The start of the question, I think, related to additional support needs and how we can protect funding. Now, your members will know we've seen an exponential increase in relation to the number of pupils with an identified additional support need in recent years. It sits at around about 40% nationally. In some schools, it's around about 50%. So you can go into that measure. It covers lots of different things. What we've done in government is we've protected funding. I'm protecting funding right now for teacher numbers. So my party, as you will all know, and as Willie has already outlined, has a policy commitment to increase teacher numbers. I'm asking local authorities right now to maintain their teacher numbers, and I'm giving them an extra £145 million to do so. My view is you cannot close the poverty-related attainment gap. You cannot respond to challenges in relation to behaviour without more teachers in our system. That's why it's really important we protect our teachers, and that's why this funding is associated with local authorities agreeing to sign up to maintain their teacher numbers. And I'm going
Am I allowed to intervene, Chair?
Thanks, Jenny. I'm also just going to quickly intervene. Jenny, I want to push you on the teacher number one, and especially on what's happening in Glasgow, because the money that you've said you've ring-fenced is not properly ring-fenced, we don't think. And Glasgow, you know, your statement the other day to local authorities felt ambiguous. It talks about smaller, manageable numbers. What does that mean? And how on earth can 450 teachers, a literal decimation of what's happening at teacher numbers in Glasgow, how can that be anything other than extremely dangerous for pupils and staff at all levels?
So look, I'm going to be really straight with you, Alan. I've protected this funding, and Glasgow City Council have not received that funding from central government because Glasgow City Council, along with every single other local authority in the country, have not yet agreed to the conditions that I've attached for that funding going out the door. You might be aware, Alan, in the last 2 years, we've seen slight falls in relation to teacher numbers. That follows gradual increases. We put additionality into the system during COVID. So we have, since 2019, over 1,000 extra teachers in Scotland, but I think we need more. This year alone, I am asking for our councils to protect teacher numbers because I think they are so vital for all the reasons that you've outlined. I'm sorry if you felt my statement to COSLA was ambiguous. I actually think it's really important that our teachers understand my position on this, because I've had to make some really tough budget decisions in the past year, as we've heard on the course of the hustings this evening. But my absolute focus as Education Secretary has been protecting this funding for teacher numbers. And I'm very clear that no local authority is going to receive that funding unless they agree to do so.
So is that an intervention in what Glasgow's doing? Will those cuts go ahead? Will you stop that?
Glasgow's not received any funding from the Scottish Government, and it will not receive any funding unless any local authority looks again at the role of teacher numbers. Now, we're engaging with local authorities across the piece, and I know COSLA has a view on this, but I don't want to pick on one local authority per se, but it's important to say that no local authority has yet received that funding because they have not yet agreed to the conditions I have attached to it, which is that they maintain teacher numbers because our teachers are so important.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. Liam, you wanted to interject, and in fact, you're next, so your 3 minutes are starting.
Right. So, well, I'll focus on the violence, and I'll put something to Jenny Gilruth whilst we're doing that. First of all, I want to commend, I'm up in Aberdeen, as many of you will know, and I want to commend the EIS Aberdeen for their research, devastating research towards the end of last year, where they discovered that 2/3 of around 800 teaching respondents had experienced assaults in the last 5 years. That's disgraceful. It's absolutely disgraceful, and I'm really pleased that the EIS put that on the table. I commend the work of the EIS more generally on this, and in some ways they are telling us what this government already knows. The Behaviour in Schools report came out and told us that we need to put more funding behind this. We need to look at class sizes. We need to look at clear consequences for people who are causing violence. I called, or my party called, a debate last May on violence in schools, and we finally got the government to take notice of it. And I commended the Cabinet Secretary at the time for that. However, that was last May, and we are still sitting here, we're still waiting on publication. Jenny Gilruth did indeed convene behaviour summits. I think I'm right in saying I and my colleagues here got together and said, Jenny, can we come on that? Can we come on those behaviour summits, because we can help? We don't want to be political. We want to contribute to this and bring knowledge and bring whatever skills that we might have. And that was refused, which I just don't understand. So how do we deal with this? Well, we have solutions. The EIS have proposed various solutions, more speciality, more training during the teacher training stage, more PSAs, more specialist places, more enhanced provision with specially trained staff. There was also the issue the Cabinet Secretary talked about, local government. We cannot be blind to the fact that local government is massively underfunded in this country. And the Scottish Government, I talked about the choices that are made earlier on, and the Scottish Government is making a choice to massively underfund our local authorities. And so just there was the issue raised about the Glasgow teachers. So as I understand it, the council is saying they've got a cash problem, but the Scottish Government has been specifically criticised for a lack of engagement, a lack of talk on this. So the fact is, it seems to me, the Scottish Government has been sitting on this issue. They are not taking it sufficiently urgently. And if they did take it seriously, they would have done something in the last year and longer. And finally, Cabinet Secretary, you talked about poverty. And you're absolutely right to do so. But that's why we cannot think in silos. And that's why when this government, the SNP government, called a debate on child poverty, a week, 2 weeks ago, and I demanded to speak in it as the education spokesperson, because I think education is one of the key linchpins to how we address child poverty. And I have to say, Jenny Gilruth, it was not lost on me that the Cabinet Secretary for Education did not make a speech in that debate.
Thank you very much, Liam. Jenny, I will let you come back in a moment.
Thank you.
Yep, let me go to Pam next.
Am I allowed to come in now, Alan, or?
20 seconds, go.
Okay. First of all, I didn't speak in that debate. The First Minister and the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice spoke in that debate, but undoubtedly education is key to tackling poverty. And I do not understand how Liam Kerr can sit there and justify £18 billion worth of cuts flowing to Scotland and how that's going to help to
Completely ignored my point, Jenny.
The current system. In relation to behaviour summits, no, I did not want members of the opposition sitting and listening to teachers talking about their personal experience of behaviour in the classroom in case it was weaponised for political ends. And there was a final question in relation to doing something. Well, on teacher numbers, I have done something. I've changed the way in which we fund teacher numbers so that instead of the government allowing money to flow out the door for the last 2 years, as we have done, I've said councils have to sign up and agree at the start to maintain teacher numbers. That's action.
Do you not call it back, though, if they don't?
Okay.
They have to agree that back. They
we'll
have
move to Pam.
To avoid it.
Thanks, Pam.
Thank you very much, Alan. So I want to start on the question itself, and then I'll come to the points about teacher numbers and MCR pathways as well, which I think is important to mention in Glasgow. I do not think it is acceptable that we've had to wait this long for any tangible action on the condition of behaviour in schools. And I understand the Cabinet Secretary has hosted summits. I agree with Liam that we should have been able to be part of that. I think it's an important part of what we do so that we don't have to ask teachers to tell their story more than once, because that's effectively all that happens, because we have to go and get that information from elsewhere, because if we're doing our job properly, we want to be listening to people. So I'm disappointed we're not involved in it. But the solutions that have been put forward by the EIS, including EIS in Aberdeen, and teachers and frontline professionals in schools for the last 2 or 3 years have been put forward to this government, and still they have delayed action on it. So what would we do? Well, first of all, I think we need to be really clear that we wouldn't tolerate violence in schools. And if a pupil had being violent to a teacher, I don't think it's acceptable that that teacher would have to face that pupil that day or the next day. And in actual fact, we need to address that properly so that staff feel safe in schools. But we also wouldn't tolerate the conditions that have led to this. And the conditions that I think have led to this are, I think, and I've said this before and some of you might have heard it, but I think the conditions in our classrooms now are like pressure cookers. So we've got pupils whose needs are not being met, not through any fault of the hardworking staff in schools, but because we don't have enough support or scaffolding around young people anymore, because CAMS can't be accessed. We've got one educational psychologist per 650 pupils. Speech and language therapy doesn't have the resource that it needs in order to be able to support all of the children who need that. Because of that, young people are not getting the support that they need. Teachers are overworked. Teachers are being asked to do much more for less, and they're being asked to do things, for example, like provide interventions that an educational psychologist might have previously provided. This situation cannot continue, and it doesn't surprise me that we have the situation that we have in schools now, but it can't continue. So we would increase the availability of reporting to teachers and empower them to report it. So, and that then it was dealt with. We would see this as a health and safety issue. We would have a national definition of what violence in schools and poor behaviour in schools was. We would encourage and empower schools to be able to create an environment where teachers could ensure they were disciplined in their classrooms, but they could also make it really clear about what pupils could expect in terms of the behaviour of each other and the behaviour of themselves. And we would make sure that there was always a debrief, because we know there aren't enough of those going on either. But crucially, I think when we see cuts to education staff, and today the SNP and the Greens lined up in Glasgow to cut the MCR pathways, a programme that is essential to supporting our young people, and that is where the problem begins, and that's why investment in schools and investment in staff is key to addressing it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pam. Willie Rennie is next.
Yeah, I've been really impressed with the EIS campaign that's been run on this. I think it's been very professional at bringing to life the daily experiences of teachers on behaviour, violence, distress, whatever we want to call it. And it is, I think, become a significant problem in almost every class. It doesn't happen all the time, but it happens almost in every class. And for those at the extreme end, it's really debilitating. It stops it's not just a lost opportunity for that individual who's behaving poorly, but also for everybody else in the class as well as the teacher, and often that's violent as well. So we need to get to grips with this. Now, I'm a liberal. I believe in trying to understand the root causes of this, and I do accept that every form of behaviour is communication. I accept that. But that doesn't mean that there should be no boundaries and there should be no consequences, because life has got consequences. We have to live within parameters, within boundaries. In life itself, adults have to do that. So we need to make sure we get the balance right on this. Now, when I was at, the others have heard this before, when I was at school, I was belted, probably far too much. Some say not enough, but I was certainly belted. And I'm glad we're no longer got that. And I'm really pleased we've moved towards understanding. But I worry that perhaps we understand to an extreme point now. The solution often that is deployed is the restorative discussions. I think in some occasions are largely pointless. I think in some cases they do work, but we need to have extra tools in the box for teachers to be empowered to make decisions that protect them and their class. And that's where I think fundamentally we need a shift. Now, how you do that in practice is hard. I accept that. but we need to have that shift so that teachers feel empowered, so they can stand up perhaps to the parents and they can stand up to the managers within education authorities and say, I made the right decision for my class and for me. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is obviously resources. I think resources is important, the language, speech and language therapists, but also the classroom assistant, extra people in the class, extra space for people to go to when they're behaving poorly. We need to have that available. So it's not just resting on the teachers. And let me just say about teacher numbers. The government's got no chance of recruiting 3,500 extra teachers. No chance. At a time when they're slashing council budgets and demanding more, not just in education, but across the piece from local authorities. We can't even keep the number of teachers we've got already. There's no chance that we're going to recruit 3,500 extra teachers. And I think Jenny should be honest about that.
Thank you very much, Willie. Nick Quayle.
In many ways, I agree with quite a bit of what Willie was saying there. However, it still comes back to resourcing. Let's take a silly example. If we were to change the pupil to teacher ratio to 1:1, we all know that we could improve attainment immediately overnight, but that would be ridiculously expensive. But it is a sliding scale. The greater the pupil teacher ratio numbers, the less ASN, the rest, the reduced support, whether it be for English as a second language, classroom assistants, the more that's cut, then that'll have an impact on education and ultimately an impact on how we can deal with behaviour. As a head teacher, I was a victim of violence on 2 occasions, and certainly had to deal with it on other occasions for other members of staff. I have to say, Pam, recording it is all very well, but it's what you do with the data, because in my experience, the recording of that, very little was done by local authorities. Something the Green Party would also want to invest money in collecting that data and understanding what's going on. And again, I agree with the points made around it's really important work.
Incidentally, I agree with you there.
Yeah, the EIS has done around collecting that data and making that point. But I have to say, I hate to sound like a broken record, folks, but it does come back to resources. And despite what Liam says, you know, when you have a limited pot of money come from the Barnett Form or whatever, terrible choices have to be made. And the money that the Scottish Government education, and then to follow up Pam's point, in councillors in Glasgow City around the Pathways programme, these are choices that are impossible choices. It's a bit like saying to a poor family, we're giving you enough money to pay your rent, now how to go and spend that on food for your children. You don't have the money. It's a real dilemma. And I think that these may be simplistic examples, but the problem is there is not enough funding. And I go back to our manifesto, which was launched today. The only way that education will prove it, and I think every teacher that's watching this webinar tonight will recognise that they've had our resources cut again and again and again, particularly, I have to say, since the Conservatives came in nationally, because that is the consequence. That's the risk that come from Westminster, through the Scottish Parliament, councils, a lack of resources. If we have increased resources, then we can tackle it. The questionnaire asked, you know, how can we change this? Due to a lack of staff. That's it. We need more staff. We need better trained staff. We need to put the resources in. Certainly, as a head teacher, that was the sort of dilemma that I had going on many, many years. I can see I'm getting the countdown, so I won't finish that question, but that point, thank you.
Oh, sorry, Nick, I was just giving you a wee countdown, but okay. Folks, thank you very much. Now, for our 4th theme, it's a very short question, and I'm going to ask you to keep your comments to about 1.5 minutes because it's so short, and because it's also been touched on already by a few of you. What will your party do to ensure funding for additional support needs in Scotland grows at the same rate as the increasing number of students with ASN needs? And it's straight back to you, Nick, for that one.
It's an interesting one. I mean, I was literally underlined with my pen there, the increasing number of students with ASN. And the question that all comes back to me as a head teacher is, oh, why do we have an increasing number of pupils with additional support needs? And I think largely it's because The profession has got much better at identifying the range of barriers to learning that teachers have to face on a day-to-day basis. And we've got much better at understanding those barriers and indeed trying to put in measures to address them. And again, I'm sorry, but this is a resourcing question as well. I don't want to keep repeating the same message and sounding like all politicians do, but the Green Party launched a manifesto today saying that we need to increase resources, and despite what everyone else says, the only real way of doing that is by putting the burden on those who can most afford it, the top 1%, increasing the tax. That will generate the money to allow us to have additional support needs. Again, just again for your audience, 10% of the wealthiest in this country hold 43% of the wealth. 10%. You're trying to tell me they cannot afford to pay a bit extra to support the children that we're working with every day, to support the teachers who are becoming increasingly better at identifying those additional support needs? I would venture, I would have to say I disagree. I think we need to spend more money, and that means increasing tax. And again, Liam, I'm sorry, it does come back to Westminster, because you can claim all the choices you want, but you and I will both know that the real term spending in education has been cut nationally, which has a consequence which comes to Scotland and ultimately to the councils. You can shake your head all you want, but everyone watching that knows that. And frankly, that's why you're doing
wrong,
so badly.
Nick. That's why. You're fundamentally wrong, because you don't understand.
Yeah, well, they're saying the 4th of July. People will see whether they agree with me or agree with you, Liam.
Thank you. Willie Rennie's next.
Right. One of the most devastating things I find these days is when you meet adults who say that they went through their whole school education not knowing they had some kind of learning disability, and their life chances are limited as a result. And I think it's great now that we have got a much more sophisticated system that's identifying these issues at an early stage so we can do something about it. But there's no point in just identifying those people. We need to support them and give them the resources that they require. Now, there's the whole debate about mainstreaming just now, and I think we need to look at exactly how that's implemented, because I think sometimes we've not got that balance right, and we need to look at the different models that we're providing. But at the end of the day, we need more resources for the class with specialist provision to make sure the teachers are capable of meeting the wide range, and it's a huge range of difficulties that people have, and they can't all be specialists on everything. So we need to look at this in segments to make sure that this works. So yes, we need to do more, but it's great that we're much more sophisticated than we used to be.
Thank you, Willie. This fact was alluded to earlier by Jenny. But the most recent pupil census figures show that 37% of pupils have an identified additional support need. In 2009, the figure was 6.5%. Now, of course, that is identified ASN. We know in our classes there may be many who don't have a diagnosed ASN. I'm going to move now to Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you for that. I agree with the comments that have been made about the identification of pupils' needs. I think that's fundamental, actually. I think it is really important that we can identify what it is that a pupil needs support with. We then have to do something about that. Otherwise, we're failing them. We're also failing teachers, because we're setting both up to fail if we don't provide the support that's needed. So I spoke earlier about the fact that can't get appointments on CAMHS, that speech and language therapy has been gutted, and that there isn't enough support from educational psychologists because there aren't enough of them either. All of that has removed some of the key scaffolding from around children and young people in our schools, and we need to rebuild that. That's one of the things that we would do by using some of the investment that we would be able to get from levying the VAT, taking the VAT exemption off of private schools. And it's not just about teachers, although it is a lot about having specialist teachers. We've seen a huge big reduction in the specialist ASN teachers in the last 10 years. That needs to change. That needs to be reversed. But also we have to support pupil support assistants as well, because every day. I mean, we spoke briefly, or we spoke a moment ago about the experience of violence in schools. Support assistants are experiencing that more often than teachers are as well. So we need to look at all of the staff around our young people, all the adults that are in the room around our young people, and make sure that we have enough of them to support the sort of young people who have the sort of needs that they do today.
Thank you, Pam. Liam.
Yeah, let me deal with this Barnett point, because Nick fundamentally misunderstands what's going on here. £43 billion comes to the Scottish Government. That's about £2,500 more per head than the rest of the UK. So the Scottish Government gets a better deal under the Barnett formula and can therefore make better choices. And even if, let's say, the UK government put up taxes such that there was more available to come up, it's not hypothecated. So you can't say because education has been taxed more, or you're going to put it into more education, because it's up to the Scottish Government, which is where Pam Duncan-Glancy's point about the independent school tax falls down. Because let's say they raise 120 million, it comes up as Barnett. It's not hypothecated. It's just like the apprenticeship levy, which comes up and doesn't have to be spent on apprentices.
Yeah, sorry, just to interrupt
the ASN issue
you're right
specifically.
about that, Liam, in terms of the VAT not being hypothecated.
That Willie and Pam and I sit on specifically looked at this issue. And I'm really glad we did. And there were SNP members and Green members as well. It was genuinely cross-party. And I think it was a very, very good inquiry. And lots of the issues that came up were terrifying to the committee, and I think we produced a good report with some good recommendations. So I commend that to, I know the EIS will be all over this, of course, but members watching this, that committee, independent cross-party committee report. It's about doing things like devolving power to heads. It's ensuring our buildings are correct. It's ensuring proper training, particularly during the teacher training. Above all, it's about council resources as well. It's about properly resourcing our councils to properly resource our schools and our ASN provision.
Thanks, Liam. Before I bring Jenny in, I'm going to give Nick 20 seconds and Pam 20 seconds because they wanted to come in. Nick, quickly.
Okay, so really, really Barnett for the bar is like, and I dare say most of the people here won't have a full understanding of it. It is incredibly difficult, and
Nick, I'm going to move away from you.
You're
breaking up. You're breaking up quite a lot, Nick.
For Scotland.
Yeah, you're breaking up. Sorry.
Okay, sorry.
Pam, I'm going to go to you just very quickly.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute there. Thank you. No, I was just saying to Liam that I understand it's not hypothecated, but there's no reason why we couldn't have a Scottish government who said we'll pass that on and use it for that end, which is what I.
So is that a commitment from you, Pam Duncan-Glancy, that if Labour forms the government after 2026, the Labour government will hypothecate all independent school taxes to the state school sector? Is that a commitment?
Our manifesto says that the VAT, I'm sure you've read it cover to cover, Liam, that the money that we would get from VAT would allow us to invest in education, and that could be the equivalent of around 1,800 teachers. And that's the sort of thing that we could do if we had that. So it's one of the ways.
That's a manifesto promise to hypothecate.
That's one of the ways that we could use taxes, the various taxes that we've set in our manifesto, to improve education and indeed healthcare and public services in Scotland.
Thank you. And Jenny, final word on this point, on this question.
Thanks, Alan. I think the original question was around about additional support needs and how we can.
It was.
Yeah, okay. I know we've drifted slightly. How long have I got? Is it a minute and 30?
An hour and a half, a minute and a half.
A minute and a half. Okay. So look, this year alone, we are providing funding to local authorities, which is at record level in relation to additional support needs. So it's over £900 million. That's at national level. And what that's translated to in the last year alone is an extra 725 learning support assistants. Now, I recognise the level of need in the system. We've heard about the disparate needs across the system. In some schools, some head teachers I speak to, it sits at over 50%. And I think it is important, to Willie's point, to recognise that these young people have always been in the system. But when I was at school, and actually probably even when I was first teaching, many of them would have completed their educational journey without a diagnosis and without that support. So I think it is welcome that we are now picking up on identifying needs earlier than we did previously. And a large part of that is down to Scotland's teachers being well trained, well equipped to recognise need. And I thank them to that end. We are protecting the budget line in relation to additional support needs. I suppose, though, this does come back to some of the challenge I faced just now in relation to teacher numbers, doesn't it? Because it is about the government at a central level ring fencing and saying this is what this funding is for. But if local authorities take political decisions at local level to do something different, then that's a challenge to the government. I think it's hugely important. Is that my time up? I think it's really important. We protect the budget. We've done so in the last year, and I'm very, very keen that we continue to protect support for additional support needs. We recognise the role of local authorities in that, but we have to have additionality in the system to respond to the additional need, particularly post-pandemic.
Thank you all. We're moving on to theme 5. It's quite a long one, so maybe up to 3 minutes. Many new and early career teachers are struggling to secure work, temporary or permanent, after graduation. What can be done to resolve this situation in a time when schools are desperate to have more people on the ground to deal with workload, pupil behaviour, ASN, and the widening attainment gap? What are the parties' plans to improve the job situation for the many experienced teachers who are facing unemployment at the end of each academic year and being forced to go through the stressful situation of proving themselves every year to secure a contract? Willie Rennie's first.
So I think you've probably gleaned from me that I'm in favour of increasing resources for education, and that would include increasing resources for teachers. I think what we've seen, though, is there's a disjointed system. The government said it was going to reduce the teacher contact time, which it's not done. And in order to do so, it would recruit 3,500 extra teachers, which it's not done. And the two are obviously connected. That's meant that we have continued to educate more teachers through the ITEs. And they're coming into the teaching profession looking for jobs which just aren't there. And that, I think, is unforgivable to allow that to happen. An awful lot of young people in particular were keen. Sometimes they were giving up good jobs to look for a career in teaching. And now they are utterly demoralised and they have been let down badly. So we need to try and resolve this issue. And we need to resolve that issue by increasing the resources to recruit more teachers. And this is particularly the case within primary, but also within some subjects in secondary. And we cannot allow the pipeline to continue to come through without the jobs available at the far end. So that's, I believe, what we should be doing. That's fed into also the short-term temporary contracts that are being utilised by some local authorities quite extensively. And I still don't fully understand why some use it to such an extent. And I don't think they should be using them to this extent. I know there will be some degree of flexibility that's required in order to match the resources with the positions available. But I think the extent of it isn't good. We managed to make a change partly through, I think, a recommendation that I made to the government that the temporary funding that was available should be made permanent, and that should reduce some of the temporary contracts that were being deployed. And that was, to be credit to Jenny's predecessor, that was used. So I want to go further, though, and fully understand why this is happening to the extent that it is. But the current situation is not acceptable, and it needs to come to an end, because we are demoralising an awful lot of people who could provide so much for our education system.
Thank you, Willie. Jenny, you're next, and I wonder, as part of your answer, if you would like to, come in on Willie's challenge there on the contact time issue, because teachers across the country are wondering what's happening there.
Well, I would like us to move tomorrow, as you know, Alan, on class contact time. And in certain parts of the country, including Fife, where Willie and I are MSPs, I understand that we could move tomorrow, but we don't yet have an agreement with our professional associations, Alan. And you also know that some other professional associations, not the EIS, have a different view on what that extra time should be used for. So look, I want us to go next week on class contact time, because I think it's really important. We need to create the headspace in the system, and I'm very acutely aware of the workload issues that the profession are currently facing. So to move on to the substantive point, which is really around about recruitment and retention. We've been here before, so it's not a new challenge. And, I speak to my officials in government on a regular basis about this, but I met with a group of parent-teacher council up in North West Highlands earlier on today to talk about this very issue, because there are rurality challenges in relation to parts of the country. I think it's really important to say from the government's perspective about the funding that we provide to train our teachers. So we don't charge, for example, tuition fees in Scotland. That means, of course, that people are able to train to become a teacher without additional debt. We don't charge for the postgrad qualification. That's supported by the government. We then fully fund the probationary year. So it's also in the government's interest to make sure we've got a system that's working for our teachers. And I recognise post-pandemic that the system is creaking. If we look, though, at the level of permanent contracts at a national level, it still sits around about 80%, which is the same as roughly what it was in 2014. So there's not been a great shift in that respect, but in certain local authority areas, the challenge is more pronounced. And one of the challenges I face as Education Secretary is, where do these probationers go? Because every local authority gets a cut of that probationer funding, as it were, from central government and that additionality. So there is a question around about the sustainability, I think, of the current probationary system, how that's meeting the needs of the workforce. And by that, I mean local authorities who employ our teachers, but also how is it meeting the needs of our new teachers coming through the system? Is it best equipping them and supporting them? Because to the point I think that Willie made, I don't want these young people, and some of them older, who've moved into teaching after doing other things, to leave after all of that investment we've put in as a government. I want them to stay and to have fulfilling careers. And I need to work with COSLA to improve that, of course, because local government employ our teachers and not Scottish Government. There are a number of local authorities who are using different bespoke approach to retention. So in Aberdeenshire, for example, in the past, historically, they've used different approaches. In the Highlands, I was chatting to officials from Highland today. They use funding through resettlement packages. And of course, in Scotland, you can tick the box. I ticked the box myself and went to Elgin for a year to receive additionality. And what we have seen, though, I should say, post-pandemic, is a reluctance to tick the box and to move to any part of the country. And there might be lots of different reasons for that shift. But I see I have 10 seconds left. I think it's important that we use this opportunity to look again at the funding coming from central government, but also at the role of local authorities who employ our teachers.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. Just a quick comment. All the unions, teacher unions, speak with one voice at the SNCT, and in that forum, we all are agreed on the cut to contact hours and how they should be used. Liam Kerr is next.
So I think there's a number of issues here. In terms of the recruitment, again, the Scottish Government cannot keep making promises that it has no intention of delivering. And simply to say we're going to get 3,500 teachers, but not think about, there are something like 300 fewer maths teachers, 300 fewer English teachers, 300 fewer science teachers than there were in 2007. So you've got to think in a more sophisticated way if you're going to be the Scottish Government. That's one thing. Then there's the issue about where the teachers are. So up here in the northeast, it can sometimes be very challenging to get specialist teachers in particular to come up. Once they come, they realise that this, I would say, is one of the best places to live in Scotland, and they might often stay. But we need to work out, Cabinet Secretary, there has to be a way for the Scottish Government to be encouraging people to come to places like the northeast, which are brilliant, but they need to come here and see that. Again, I think this comes back to councils being underfunded. So you take the example of Falkirk Council. I think it's facing a £62 million funding gap. And so it's talking about reconfiguring the school week. Now, I know, rightly in my view, the EIS has come out very strongly against this because it's saying, look, that could have an impact on young people's education, and it could be a roundabout way to remove teachers from the system. And obviously that is deeply unacceptable. There's also the issue about councils being so under-resourced that they're having to fill posts with probationers, which anecdotally seems to be going on. The Scottish Government needs to be getting on top of that. Final point I'll make, Alan, is I think the Scottish Government needs to recognise, or it needs to respect the teachers as a profession, respect their views, and ensure that it is perceived. We don't allow this narrative to develop, based on some of the stuff that's going on at the moment that we discussed earlier, like the violence in schools, which might discourage people from going into it. So one of the things that we've looked at in the New Deal, like the EIS rightly do, is talking about reducing contact hours. It's about smaller class sizes, which I seem to remember the SNP government promised, but hasn't delivered. It's about reducing red tape. It's about paying teachers for extracurricular activities. And it's about dealing with the violence with the urgency that, frankly, it's not being given by this Scottish Government.
Thank you, Liam. Jenny, I'll let you come back. 20 seconds.
Very briefly, Liam talked about support for local authorities, for example, in the North East, and I declare an interest as a native of the North East, but I've had really positive engagement with Aberdeenshire Council on this very issue, and I've asked officials to look at probationer allocation for this year, and we've been able to increase their probationer allocation as a result of that. I'm also working with Highland Council on exactly the same approach. We've got to have a more nuanced approach to how we can support local authorities with challenges, particularly in relation to subject areas. I'm very live to that, and I just want to put on the record the action we have taken this year alone. But I do think more systemically, we need to look at the probationer system.
Thank you. Nick Quayle is next.
Yeah, so I guess I'll go back to my experience here as a head teacher, and I guess the last 30 years in education. I don't understand why we can't get our workforce planning right. This seems to be a perpetual question. Some years we go and other years we go to feast. When I was a head teacher, I ran for a year without a physics teacher and for about a year without 2 maths teachers. And yes, there's variation between different subject areas, but it seems we've now moved to the opposite, where there's a surplus of teachers and there's not the places for them. I've attended what was then Learning and Teaching Scotland events where they talked about the work they do around workforce planning. It seems to me that we still need to do some work getting it right. We're not matching up our demographics and our changes to the amount of teachers that we need, and indeed the funding that goes into the teacher training programme. Yeah, I have immense sympathy for people who have not got a job. When I started my teaching career back in '92, I spent about 8 months looking for my first post before again, I absolutely relate to the difficulties that people are experiencing. However, I think there is something not quite right about our workforce planning, and I'm just making that as a general point. And I probably agree with the consensus of what the panel are saying as well, that we need to put more resources back into ensuring, or having a look at the probationary system and ensuring that we have places for these teachers to go to. And indeed, if the Green Party were allowed to raise taxes and invest in education as we want, then we would require more teachers. So those teachers who are currently looking for work would in fact have an opportunity to get that work.
Thank you very much, Nick. And we end with this section with Pam. I think Pam may have frozen. Can anyone of my colleagues help with that or get her to log in and out again? Okay, while we sort that, is everyone else hearing me okay? Yes. Right. Just as a quick introduction to question 6, which is going to be about a reserved matter, employment rights. I want to ask you a yes or no question. Do you support the deeming of wages if workers take action short of strike action? Nick Quayle.
No. The Green Party want to ensure that all workers have in fact, we want to repeal the Trade Union Act that the Tories have introduced. There is, dare I say it, there has been an atmosphere around demonising the unions and include the EIS and professional bodies in that. We need to get past that. We need to be looking at working in partnership with the trade unions. The best workplace examples of that are where the trade unions and employers work in partnership to resolve situations. It is entirely possible, but unfortunately we seem to have developed a situation around, particularly in further education, where it's them versus us. And again, that's very unfortunate.
Thank you, Nick. Willie Rennie?
No, I don't support it. I am depressed, though, that we've had 10 years of industrial action. I think I can tell amongst college staff that they are just fed up that this has been going on for so long. And we do need to have a reset. We need to have an improved relationship between
Thank
management and the staff, and it's just not acceptable the way that it's progressing. And
Thank you.
I think we all need to put our shoulder to the wheel to make that work.
Yeah.
Because it's just not sustainable as it is.
Thank you. Pam, I'll come back to you in a moment, but right now everyone's answering a very short question. Do you support deeming of wages if workers take actions short of strike action? Liam Kerr.
I think Willie's made exactly the right point. This has become so fractious with the industrial action each year. I think there has to be a reset. I talked earlier about perhaps some of the ways that that might happen. I do think the Scottish Government has to step in on this and take control. These are public bodies that we're dealing with, therefore the Scottish Government needs to deal with it.
Thanks, Liam. I'll take that as a no, that you don't support deeming. Jenny?
No, to your question, Alan, I don't. And I'm looking at the chat bar to Lynn Rooney and co. I can see all of your questions and comments, and I'm reading them all with intrigue. But look, we're in a really challenging situation in relation to the colleges sector. I think, as I said at the start of the hustings, this isn't something that's happened over the course of the last year. It's been going on for a number of years. And as Willie and Liam have intimated, I don't think our lecturers want this to continue. We want to get to a resolution. I have to say in defence of my minister that Graham Day is working really hard and he engages very closely with our trade unions, including the EIS. And I just want to put that on the record because he's not here to defend himself. And I think that's...
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, thank you. Pam, just on that question before I let you back in on the other one.
Thank you. Apologies. I just dropped off. My internet connection must have failed me. So I'm really sorry about that. And sorry if I repeat anything that has already been said or misunderstand things. On deeming, no, I don't support it.
Thank you. That's fine, Pam. Yeah. Would you like to finish on the precarity question?
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I think we've got this really, and my colleagues actually have already, other panel members have already kind of alluded to this, but we've got what I think is quite a ridiculous situation and an unacceptable situation where we've got probationary teachers that can't get permanent jobs, but we've got gaps in teaching across the country. So we've got gaps in computing science, gaps in physics, gaps in home economics, gaps in STEM subjects. We know that we're not recruiting enough people to the target courses as well in the initial teacher education programmes. And if we can't do that, then we're not going to provide the pipeline of teachers that we're going to need in the future. So we have to get a grip of that. We have to make sure that we address the under-recruitment onto these courses so that we've got that pipeline coming through. And part of that is about all of the things that we've been speaking about tonight, and actually is about largely a number of the issues that you've pointed out in your Stand Up for Quality Education campaign. It's about making sure that teaching becomes a profession that people want to be part of. If we don't address workload, we don't address the issues that pupils with additional support needs are facing, the intolerable situation, I think the committee report described it as, and my colleague Liam Kerr mentioned that report and the work of that committee earlier. I'd commend the report to people. You've probably all read it, but I think it was a really, really good piece of work. So if we don't address that, then we're not going to attract people into becoming teachers. So that is the problem we need to solve. And just to finish on the situation in Glasgow, I don't think it's an acceptable situation where we've had to rely on probationary teachers to fill posts because the SNP and the Greens have cut the posts in Glasgow.
Thank you, Pam. We will now move to our final question. And because the deeming question took a little longer than I intended, I'll ask you to keep this to 2 minutes. Education is a devolved matter, but employment legislation is not. What is your party's position on trade unions generally and repealing anti-trade union legislation specifically, especially the Strikes Act, but also earlier legislation, for example, from 2016, that imposes undemocratic thresholds on trade unions? Are you supporting the campaign to save the Trade Union Education Centre, which is a vital resource to the trade unions and to communities in Scotland? And if yes, what can you do to strengthen the campaign? And if not, then why not? Liam.
Okay, what do I feel about trade unions? I am an employment lawyer to trade up in the northeast. So I've had an awful lot of dealing with various trade unions, particularly in the offshore sector. And now, obviously, in teaching, particularly, and people should look back. I have contributed to a debate by Neil Findlay back in the last session of Parliament. I spoke very much in favour of the trade unions. I think the role that the trade unions play is absolutely vital. I alluded earlier on to the EIS Aberdeen report on violence in schools. The role that the offshore unions have played in increasing health and safety up here in the Northeast is second to none. I see. So look at my speeches, because I will say it today. I think the trade unions play a vital role. They're absolutely integral to relations. I suspect your members may struggle to believe me on that, so I simply refer you to my speeches in Parliament on the Trade Union Education Centre. Because I'm a Northeast representative, I'm not directly involved in the way that someone like Pam would be. It does seem sensible to me to provide training to trade union representatives and members, having dealt with a lot of representatives and members of unions, the value that they bring when they have been properly trained so that you can negotiate is huge. And so it seems very sensible to me to have that provision. So that's probably the best answer I can
Would you
give
repeal the anti-trade union laws then, Liam?
Just going to come in.
I'm an MSP, so I'm not in a position to do anything about it.
What do you
There's a
suspect?
general election on,
What do you
Liam.
suspect?
I have spoken when the minimum service levels legislation was going through. Again, I gave a speech in Parliament. Once again, the Scottish Government has locus to do as it wishes. It's devolved such that what was brought in south of the border is not necessarily.
Yes, we are in national election hustings, Liam. So if you'd like to enunciate your party's stance on that nationally about repealing trade union, what do you think is the likelihood of them doing that?
I wouldn't comment, Nick.
I think well, that's
what you'll discover if you ever get far in
I couldn't
politics,
possibly
that's
say
not how
yes,
it
of
works,
course.
fella.
Thank you both, and we'll move to Jenny.
Thanks, Alan. Okay, so first of all, I think the first part of the question was around about education being devolved, but employment law is not. And of course, I suppose worthwhile pointing out, the reason employment law is not devolved is because during negotiations after the referendum, the unionist parties, as part of the Smith Commission, blocked the devolution of employment law. So that's why it's not in the gift of the Scottish Parliament to change these things. I think in terms of trade unions generally, I am very supportive of strong trade union representation. And of course, the SNP's got a really strong track record in relation to trade union rights. We will fight to scrap the Minimum Service Levels Act, which is an attack on the right to strike. In my previous post, actually, as Transport Minister, I tried to engage with the UK government on this. They were not interested at that time because that legislation doesn't just impact on teachers, it impacts on a range of different professions. And it's really important in a democratic society that workers have the right to organise freely and to take industrial action as they see fit.
You don't have to do it in Scotland.
Sorry?
Isn't that right? You are not obliged to do the same thing in Scotland as they've done down in England.
Well, we're looking at how we can best protect Scotland through the legislation, actually, Liam, but there is an ambiguity there in terms of how that legislation from central government, UK level, will interact with devolved services. That's certainly been my experience in this role, but also in transport. I think also in relation to the Trade Union Act, the 2016 Act, SNP MPs have continued to press the UK government on this. We want it repealed, and we also support fair work principles. Alan, the end of the question related to the Trade Union Education Centre, which is not, as I understand it, directly funded by Scottish Government. But if there is anything we can do to help support that, I'm happy to look at it. It is ultimately, I think, a matter that City of Glasgow College have been considering. But I am a former EIS member. I have taken industrial action as an EIS member. So I support our trade unions and their right to strike.
Thank you, Jenny. Lock in place. Oh, yeah. Back to Nick, appropriately. Okay.
Yeah, first of all, I just got a text from someone saying that I'd said yes to deeming. Let me be clear, that should have been no. If I misspoke, apologies for any confusion, as probably the rest of my answer indicated. I'll look back on the video. I'm still convinced I said the right thing. Anyway, yes, employment legislation. I mean, our little tete-a-tete with Liam probably already indicated my feelings around that. It is a national issue. The Green Party policy is to repeal the legislation and indeed to important part of our democratic process and protecting all the rights that have been hard won over many years. And I include them when you think about the EIS campaigns over the last 5 years around LGBTI, around migrants, around the climate education. They perform an incredibly important role, and anything that's blocking them from performing that role, I think, is counterproductive. Yes, so the Green Party would roll back that legislation nationally. Again, as I indicated in my answer, I mean, I was a learning rep and EIS, still an EIS member. I think they are incredibly important, and all trade unions are incredibly important in protecting the workers and continuing to fight for the protection in the workplace that, let's be honest, so many organisations in the current climate, when we have 0 hours contracts, when we have austerity biting hard, it is really the trade unions that are protecting us from the worst of those excesses.
Thank you very much, Nick. Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you. I joined the trade union when I got my first job in Glasgow in 2005. I joined Unison. I've been a member of GMB, Unison, and Community. And it was actually through the trade union movement and the collective solidarity of the workers' movement that really kind of got me politicised. So I fundamentally believe in support and will promote the rights of trade unions and trade union members to strike. Our Labour Party manifesto, I'm really proud to say, said that it will, and we will repeal the Strikes Act that was in 2016. And in addition to that, we'll also set up a single enforcement body to make sure that the workers' rights outlined in Angela Rayner's New Deal for Working People and all the other workers' rights in trade union legislation that exist are upheld across the country. And that's exactly the sort of enforcement body that could take action on what we're seeing just now in colleges, including Demon. So I'm really proud of that. Yeah, I would encourage everybody to go and have a wee look at the detail on it in the manifesto. On the point about the Trade Union Education Centre, there are 2 trade union education centres in Scotland, I believe one in Fife and one in Glasgow. And the proposals of the City College in Glasgow just now to close it is because they basically said that the rest of the provision can be provided in one centre in Fife. Now that doesn't work for several reasons for me. Number one, and I would say this as a representative of Glasgow, but Glasgow's history in the trade union movement cannot be separated from it, and I think that they would do that. Number two, there are not enough resources in trade union education in Scotland, and reducing that by half would be a serious concern. Number three, the assumption that staff can just move to work to a different location, despite and indeed as well as the fact that we can do this online, is not a solution to ask workers to move like that. But also, it's not a solution for students to have to look to relocate as well. So for all those reasons, I think we should be acting to protect it. And I'm pleased to hear the Cabinet Secretary, Jenny Gilruth, tonight say that she would look at what she can do to support that and protect it. The first thing I'd say is please write with me to the principal and make it clear that you don't think they should be closing the trade union centre. And you could also sign my member's motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam.
I presume that's me. Sorry, you broke up a bit.
Yes,
yeah.
Willie, I'm so sorry.
Yeah. No, that's fine. No, it's not really from. I've actually never been a member of a trade union, but I fully support trade unions. I think they do an incredible job. They really challenge collectively government, but also employers, and I think we couldn't do without them. People who don't particularly have a strong voice, I think, absolutely need to be a member of a trade union, and I would encourage everybody to join it, even though I've never followed that advice myself. So I think it's important to support trade unions. If the new Labour government, which I expect it to be, if they bring forward the proposals to repeal the legislation, we'll support that. I think it's the right thing to do. It was a political tool by the Conservative government to create division, and I think it shouldn't be encouraged to do that. And I support the Trade Union Centre, although I think everybody should come to Fife. I don't know why there's such a revulsion to come to Fife. It's Jenny and I'm sure we'd welcome you with open arms, but we should keep the Glasgow Centre open, and I'll do what I can to help. In fact, I've signed a motion, I think, in Parliament, and I'll do anything else that's required.
Yeah, thank you, Will. Thank you. Colleagues, we're now moving towards the end of our evening. Each party representative has 1 minute to make a closing remark to try to convince us to vote for them in this general election. We're going to start with Pam.
Thank you. And just to say, I've really enjoyed tonight. Thank you for all the contributions. Thank you to my fellow panelists for keeping my arguments and theirs, I guess, sharp. And thank you for everybody who's given up a substantial part of their evening, having probably been teaching and working all day. I fundamentally believe this election is a key moment in our nation's history. We can continue with more of the same, which I think all of us tonight can agree is not an option. Or we can have change with the Labour Party. And I've set out some of what we would do tonight in our first 6 steps. I've also set out what I believe our vision in education should be, how we would use the powers across the UK to influence what could happen, not just here in Scotland, but across the UK, and what we could do then going forward into the 2026 election. We can stop the chaos, we can turn the page, we can restore hope, and we can rebuild our country. And I fundamentally believe that education must be at the heart of how we do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. Nick.
So just to follow on from the last, and then I'll make some more general points. Yes, for your membership, absolutely immediately repeal anti-trade union laws and support greater collective bargaining in those sectors that are not traditionally well represented, low paid, women, etc., like care sector. In terms of national priorities and national policies, the Green Party would like to invest 28 billion in tackling the climate crisis and making that transition to green technologies, including renewable energy, home retrofitting, battery storage, phasing out of fossil fuels with no licenses for North Sea oil and gas, investing in that new affordable fast rail connections across the UK, as I've already mentioned several times, curiously with this discussion, a wealth tax of 1%, which will release 70 billion, perhaps most importantly, invest that in the education services that we've all opinionated on tonight, but we're the only party that's actually got a way of tackling the issues of trust in terms of financing it. And also, as you know, we support the powers to hold a constitutional referendum, so Scotland can have a say on independence in its own time of choosing, and also providing safe haven for people fleeing conflict and persecution by stopping the terrible Rwanda plan deportation and closing the detention centres. So vote like our future depends on it. Vote.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Willie.
Yeah, thanks for this evening. It's been an invigorating discussion. I think we need to, first of all, end the disorder and the chaos. And we need to have government that works, because government hasn't worked for a long time. We've had governments that have reached for easy, simplistic solutions that don't work, whether that's Brexit or Liz Truss's budget or whatever else. So what you get with the Liberal Democrats is a local champion who will stick up for you and your community. And in those seats across the country where Liberal Democrats are challenging to win, I would encourage you to vote Liberal Democrat. We will make a priority case for social care, for mental health, for climate action that works, making a real difference, banning that to make an improvement to our climate, on education, which we focused on this evening, of reform of the political system. Those are all priorities for the Liberal Democrats. But what we need is moderate disorder. We need a centre-left government that makes a difference for the country, because I think we've had enough of the chaos. We need order for a change.
Thank you, Willie. Jenny.
Thanks, Alan. So in this election, the SNP offers a positive, hopeful alternative to the broken Westminster system and to more years of austerity. And in this general election, the SNP is pledging to deliver independence, to strengthen our economy, to tackle the cost of living crisis, and to bring about a fairer country. We want to defend Scotland's Parliament against attacks on our democracy and more Westminster power grabs. We want to grow Scotland's economy, to reverse the disaster of Brexit and rejoin the EU with all of the economic and social benefits that would bring. And we want to demand an emergency budget at Westminster to reverse the cuts to public spending and to deliver meaningful investment in economic growth, including green energy. We want to end the damaging hostile environment policies that are not only inhumane, but which threaten Scotland's workforce and hold back our economic growth. Scotland's education system and Scotland's learners and children will not be helped by £18 billion worth of public sector cuts. Austerity, Brexit, the cost of living crisis are Westminster-made problems. They are political choices accepted by Labour and the Tories, and no matter which unionist party forms the next UK government, we need strong voices to stand up for Scotland, for our people and for their future.
Thank you, Jenny.
I'd just like to say I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here tonight. I said at the start, it's extremely important that education issues are aired. And again, I congratulate the EIS and thank the EIS for ensuring that what is ultimately a devolved matter is on the table. Pam Duncan-Glancy is right. It should absolutely be at the heart of the entirety of the discussion. Unfortunately, she and Nick are fundamentally wrong in their understanding of how the funding works, and actually what their policies would do for us in the Northeast is throw 100,000 oil and gas jobs under a bus. The fact is that we've got the largest block grant, cash terms block grant in devolution history sitting with the SNP government. This is all about their choices about how to spend it, and it's their choices about the devolved matter of education. And I fundamentally believe that the wrong choices are being made. I believe, above all, we need to see action on violence, on the resources, and ultimately on the respect for our professionals. And we've just not been seeing it from this SNP government.
Alan, since
Thank
I
you.
was specifically mentioned there, can I respond?
No, Nick, we're at a close.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to just say a couple of things in closing, everyone. I've been an English teacher in Edinburgh for 30 years, and I've often invited politicians into my classroom. And I want to say tonight what I've said to them, which is politicians get a very, very bad rap. They are demonized. They too are subject to violence and aggression. We are just 4 days after the anniversary of the murder of Joe Cox. And it's my experience that politicians are fundamentally decent people who want the best for our society. And I want to thank you all, and meeting you in person, and those of you for the first time tonight, I include you in that esteem. We have, as Joe said, much more in common than separates us. Tonight has been lively, invigorating, and really, really helpful, I think, for everybody who's listened. I want to thank you all for coming tonight and giving your time. And to the audience, I want you to say, I hope this has been helpful. Please go out and cast your votes now in the general election and enjoy the rest of your evening.